Introduction. He thought his bank was thriving, until he went undercover and discovered a terrified employee trapped under an oppressive manager's rule. Ethan Carter had dedicated his entire career to the banking industry. He wasn't born into privilege, didn't have powerful connections. Every step of his journey had been earned, starting as a part-time teller in college, juggling coursework and long shifts while dealing with impatient customers. He knew what it meant to clock in and out, to worry about making ends meet. Even after becoming CEO of Hanover National Bank, Ethan refused to make decisions from a distant, cushy office. Numbers on a spreadsheet couldn't capture the real experience of his employees. He believed the true stories lived in the break rooms, in whispered conversations between coworkers, in the exhaustion hidden behind forced smiles. That's why, every few months, he went undercover. No suit, no title, just another customer walking into his own bank. 1. A routine visit turned suspicious. Ethan Carter had conducted these visits many times before. Walking into one of his own branches in a casual outfit, blending in with the customers, and observing the environment firsthand had always been his way of understanding what truly happened on the front lines. On this particular evening, as he stepped into the Hanover National Bank branch in Columbus, Ohio, he expected the usual minor inefficiencies, perhaps a long wait time, an employee who needed more training, or a customer who was having difficulty with a transaction. But as soon as he entered, something felt off. The bank was relatively quiet. It was late afternoon, and only a handful of customers were inside, finishing up their transactions before heading home. The air conditioning was a little too cold, and the fluorescent lighting cast a slightly harsh glow on the polished tile floors. Ethan scanned the room. The tellers were moving with well-practiced efficiency, handling deposits and withdrawals like they had done it thousands of times before. A loan officer sat at a desk near the side, explaining terms to a customer. Everything seemed normal at first glance. But then Ethan noticed a small yet telling detail, a tension in the air, subtle but unmistakable. At one of the teller stations, a middle-aged man fumbled with his debit card, trying to explain something to the young woman behind the counter. She smiled politely, maintaining professionalism, but her body language betrayed her unease. There was something about the way she kept glancing toward the back of the room, as if expecting someone to intervene or watching for danger. Ethan followed her gaze and spotted him. A tall man in a stiff gray suit standing near the back, his arms crossed, eyes surveying the employees with an intensity that felt more like surveillance than supervision. His posture wasn't just watchful, it was controlling. He wasn't just observing his team, he was dominating them. Then Ethan heard it. A soft, muffled sob. At first, it was barely noticeable, a quiet sound hidden beneath the faint hum of the bank's operations. But as the customer in front of him finished his transaction and moved along, the sound became clearer. Someone was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the kind of stifled sob that comes from someone trying desperately to keep it together. Ethan turned slightly, tracing the sound to the hallway on the left. The break room door was slightly ajar, and through the small gap, he saw her. A young woman, her head bowed, fingers gripping the edge of the table as though she was holding on for dear life. Beside her, another employee, a young man in his mid-20s, spoke in hushed tones, his posture tense. Ethan didn't know her name yet, but he recognized the emotions on her face. Fear, helplessness, exhaustion. This wasn't just stress from a busy shift. This was something deeper, something worse. His instincts told him to walk over, ask if she was okay, but at that moment, he was just another customer, a stranger. Instead, he did what he did best. He listened. The male employee's voice was quiet but urgent. "Lena, you can't let him control you like this. He doesn't own you." Her response was barely above a whisper, but it sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "What choice do I have?" she murmured. "He made it clear. If I don't do what he says, I'm gone." Ethan's grip tightened around the deposit slip in his hand. His first thought was that she was dealing with a difficult customer, but the way she said, "If I don't do what he says," made it clear. This wasn't about a customer. This was about someone inside the bank. Before he could think further, the teller at the counter called out to him. "Sir, I can help you over here." Ethan turned and stepped forward, offering a polite smile to the young man behind the counter. His name tag read Kenny. He looked fresh out of college, trying his best to put on a professional demeanor, but there was something off about his expression, like he was hiding something. "How's your day going?" Ethan asked casually, keeping his tone light. Kenny hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, but Ethan caught it. "It's been good," he replied, forcing a smile. "How can I help you today?" Ethan handed him the deposit slip, watching closely as Kenny entered the account number. There it was again, that moment of hesitation, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers hovered over the keyboard just a second too long before typing. Ethan glanced at the back of the room again. The manager in the stiff gray suit, Hastings, according to his name tag, was still watching everything like a hawk. When Kenny saw Ethan looking in Hastings' direction, he stiffened even more. Ethan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough for Kenny to hear. "Do you work in banking?" Kenny asked suddenly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What makes you ask?" Kenny hesitated, then shrugged. You seem like you've been in a branch before." Ethan smiled. "Yeah, I used to be a teller. A long time ago." Something in Kenny's face shifted, a mix of relief and hesitation, like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. Ethan gave him a moment, but Kenny quickly glanced over his shoulder again, toward Hastings. And just like that, the opportunity was gone. Kenny slid the receipt across the counter. "Here you go, sir. Anything else I can help with?" Ethan took the receipt, but wasn't ready to leave. "No, I'm good," he said, pocketing it. Then, lowering his voice again, he added, "But take care of yourself, Kenny." Kenny stiffened just slightly, but Ethan saw it. He stepped away from the counter, heading toward the exit, but he had no intention of leaving. Instead, he stopped near the loan officer's desk and pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages. From this vantage point, he had a perfect view of the break room. Lena had wiped her face and was sitting up straight now, trying to pull herself together, but her hands still trembled in her lap. The male employee beside her, Miles, according to his name tag, was speaking urgently, shaking his head, but Lena wouldn't meet his eyes. Then, Ethan saw it. Hastings, walking toward them. His steps were slow, calculated, like a predator approaching its prey. And as soon as Lena saw him, she tensed. She hurriedly grabbed her phone, stuffing it into her pocket, and stood up as if she had been caught doing something wrong. Hastings said something Ethan couldn't hear. Whatever it was, Lena gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, then walked past him, head down, back to her station. Ethan wasn't sure what he had just witnessed, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a bad work environment. Something was very wrong here, and he wasn't walking away. 2. Discovering the source of fear. Ethan Carter stood near the loan officer's desk, pretending to check his phone, but his attention remained fixed on the break room. His instincts were rarely wrong, and everything about the scene he had just witnessed set off alarm bells. The stiff posture, the tension in the tellers, the hushed sobs. Something was deeply wrong inside this branch, and he intended to find out what. He glanced toward the teller stations. Lena was back at her post, assisting a customer with an emotionless, mechanical efficiency. If he hadn't seen her a few minutes earlier, he never would have suspected anything was wrong. She had the kind of mask that employees in toxic workplaces often wore, the ability to pretend everything was fine while barely holding themselves together. But Ethan had seen it, and he wasn't going to ignore it. His eyes flicked to the back of the room, where Hastings, the branch manager, stood with arms crossed. The way he watched Lena sent a chill through Ethan. It wasn't the observational gaze of a supervisor ensuring work was being done. It was possessive, controlling. Ethan took a deep breath and made a decision. He wasn't leaving until he got to the bottom of this. A cautious approach. He needed an opening. A direct approach could spook both Lena and the other employees. If they were truly afraid of Hastings, they might shut down, unwilling to speak. So Ethan started small. He approached Miles, the young man who had been comforting Lena in the break room earlier. Miles was now organizing a stack of deposit slips at a side counter, his jaw tight with residual tension. "Hey, do you have a pen?" Ethan asked casually. Miles looked up, startled. then quickly grabbed a pen from the cup beside him. Yeah, of course. Ethan took it but didn't walk away. Thanks. Miles, right? The young man hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Ethan lowered his voice just enough to make it clear this wasn't just small talk. I couldn't help but notice your friend seemed upset earlier. Miles' grip on the deposit slips tightened. She's fine. Ethan tilted his head slightly. She doesn't look fine. Miles swallowed, his gaze darting briefly toward Hastings, who was now speaking to another employee at the back of the bank. When he turned back to Ethan, there was something in his eyes, conflict. A silent debate on whether he could trust this stranger. Miles hesitated. It's not my place. Ethan nodded, letting the silence settle for a moment. Then he asked a different question. How long has she worked here? Miles blinked at the shift in the conversation, but answered automatically. A little over a year. Does she like it here? That was the moment Ethan saw it. Miles' mask slipping just a little. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. No, but she can't afford to leave. And there it was. The real problem. Lena wasn't just unhappy. She wasn't just stressed. She was trapped. A pattern of control. Ethan glanced toward the teller stations again. Lena was still assisting customers, moving with robotic precision. Hastings, however, had stopped watching her. He was looking at Ethan now. The realization didn't rattle him. If anything, it confirmed what he already suspected. Hastings was the source of this fear. And now, he was aware that Ethan had noticed. Returning his attention to Miles, Ethan decided to push just a little further. It's more than just stress, isn't it? Miles' breathing hitched slightly. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the stack of papers in front of him. I can't, Miles started, but Ethan cut in gently. You don't have to say anything you're not comfortable with. But if something's wrong, I want you to know it doesn't have to stay that way. Miles let out a slow breath. It's just, Lena isn't the only one. Ethan's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Miles hesitated again, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the counter. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, Hastings. He picks employees he thinks won't fight back. The ones who need the job too much to risk losing it. Ethan had seen this before. A toxic manager who preyed on vulnerability, exploiting employees who felt powerless to stand up for themselves. It was a calculated abuse of authority, and it needed to end. The next step, Ethan knew he had to act carefully. If he confronted Hastings now, he could scare off any chance of getting Lena or the others to open up. Worse, Hastings might retaliate before Ethan could do anything to protect them. Instead, he played it smart. Thanks, Miles, Ethan said, his voice calm. I appreciate your help. Miles looked like he wanted to say more, but fear held him back. So Ethan gave him a reassuring nod and stepped away. He needed to talk to Lena, but not here. Not while Hastings was watching. He glanced toward the side entrance of the bank, where employees sometimes stepped out for breaks. A few minutes later, as if the universe was working in his favor, Kenny, the young teller from earlier, stepped outside, scrolling through his phone. Ethan took his chance. He walked outside, hands in his pockets, approaching casually. Long day? Kenny looked up, startled. Then, recognizing Ethan from earlier, he relaxed slightly. Yeah, Fridays are always busy. Ethan nodded, then lowered his voice. Mind if I ask you something? Kenny hesitated, but eventually shrugged. Sure. Your branch manager, Hastings. What's he like? Kenny's expression darkened. It was quick, just a flicker, but Ethan caught it. He's strict, Kenny said carefully. Likes things done a certain way. Ethan tilted his head. Is that normal for managers? Kenny exhaled, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, he's not just strict. He pushes people. Hard. Especially Lena. Ethan's muscles tensed. How so? Kenny hesitated again, then swallowed hard. He makes her stay late. Alone. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. She's the only one? Kenny nodded grimly. Yeah. And he's always talking to her like she owes him something. I've seen it, man. The way she tenses up when he calls her into his office. It's not normal. Ethan had heard enough. This wasn't just a bad boss. This was something far worse. And now, he knew exactly what he had to do. Ethan turned his gaze back toward the bank, his mind already forming a plan. Lena was still inside, still under Hastings' control, but not for much longer. 3. The manager's intimidation. Ethan Carter had seen a lot of bad managers in his time. He had witnessed supervisors who micromanaged their employees into exhaustion, team leads who thrived on power trips, and bosses who created environments so toxic that even the best workers crumbled under the weight of stress. But Ronald Hastings? He was different. Hastings didn't just intimidate, he ruled. And Ethan was going to put an end to it. Ethan had gathered enough information from Miles and Kenny to confirm his suspicions. Hastings had been preying on vulnerable employees, singling out those who couldn't afford to leave and making them feel powerless. And Lena? She was his latest victim. Ethan had planned to wait for the right moment to act, but as he re-entered the bank, he realized he wouldn't have to wait long. The moment he stepped back inside, Hastings was watching him. A silent power struggle. Hastings' eyes locked onto Ethan's with a sharp intensity. The manager had noticed Ethan's presence earlier, but now he was seeing him as a threat. The CEO had spent years studying people, understanding their behaviors, reading their body language, and Hastings was screaming insecurity and control. He stood near the back of the branch, his arms crossed, his gaze flickering between Ethan and the employees. Ethan pretended not to notice. He walked casually toward the teller stations, taking in the nervous glances from Miles and Kenny. Lena, however, was frozen in place. She had just finished with a customer and was now shuffling some papers, avoiding eye contact with Hastings. Ethan could feel the tension. It was thick, suffocating. Every employee in that room knew exactly who held the power, and they knew the consequences of challenging it. A calculated move. Ethan took a deep breath, adjusting his stance to look more like a customer and less like the CEO of the bank. He approached Lena's counter with a polite smile. "Excuse me," he said, just loud enough for Hastings to hear. "I need to ask you something." Lena looked up, startled. She wasn't sure if she should respond. Her eyes darted toward Hastings for approval. That was all Ethan needed to see. She was afraid to speak. Before she could answer, Hastings stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the polished tile. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was smooth, controlled, but the underlying challenge was clear. Ethan turned slowly, meeting Hastings' gaze with an easy confidence. "No problem," he replied casually. "Just asking a quick question." Hastings' lips curled into a forced smile. "Well, Lena is quite busy at the moment. Perhaps another employee can assist you." Ethan didn't break eye contact. "I think Lena can handle it." Lena swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter. She looked between the two men, as if caught in the middle of something far bigger than a simple customer interaction. Hastings' nostrils flared slightly. He didn't like being challenged, especially not in his own domain. "Sir," he said, his voice still composed, but with an unmistakable edge, "I'd be happy to help you myself if you need assistance." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "That's very kind of you." He paused, letting the moment stretch out just enough to make Hastings uncomfortable. "But I'd prefer to speak with Lena." The silence in the room was deafening. Miles and Kenny had both stopped what they were doing, pretending to work while stealing glances at the interaction. Even a few customers seemed to pick up on the tension. The breaking point. Hastings took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I don't know who you think you are, but I run this branch." Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out his wallet and flipped it open, revealing his ID badge. The gold lettering gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Ethan Carter," he said, his voice quiet but commanding, "CEO of this bank." Lena gasped. Miles' eyes widened. Kenny nearly dropped the stack of receipts he was holding. The room, once filled with unspoken fear, was now thick with stunned silence. Hastings blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. His mouth opened, then closed as he struggled to process the revelation. "Sir, Ethan cut him off. "I don't like what I've seen here today, Mr. Hastings." His tone remained calm, but his words carried undeniable weight. And I definitely don't like the way you treat your employees. Hastings stammered. I assure you, there's been some misunderstanding. Ethan held up a hand. Save it. He turned to Lena, his expression softening. Are you okay? Lena hesitated. She glanced at Hastings, as if expecting some kind of consequence for answering truthfully. Ethan caught the look. You don't have to be afraid anymore. For the first time that day, Lena's posture shifted. Her shoulders, once held tight with anxiety, relaxed slightly. She took a shaky breath. No, I'm not okay. It was the quietest admission, but in that moment, it was the most powerful thing she could have said. The end of an era. Ethan turned back to Hastings, who was now visibly sweating. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to step into your office, and we're going to have a conversation. Right now. Hastings hesitated. I don't think that's necessary. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Do you really want to find out what happens if you refuse? The fear in Hastings' eyes was different now. It wasn't the power-driven intimidation he wielded over his employees. It was real, genuine fear. Because for the first time, he wasn't in control. Without another word, Hastings turned and walked stiffly toward his office. Ethan turned to the remaining employees. You're safe now, he reassured them. Then, addressing Miles and Kinney, he added, Stay with Lena. I'll handle this. The two young men nodded, stepping closer to their colleague as if silently vowing to protect her. Ethan exhaled as he followed Hastings toward his office. This was why he did these undercover visits, not for performance reports, not for financial assessments, but for the people. Leadership wasn't about power. It was about responsibility, and Hastings had just lost any right to hold it. 4. Confronting the problem head-on. Ethan Carter followed Ronald Hastings into the manager's office, closing the door behind him. The small space was meticulously arranged, but despite its neatness, the air felt heavy. It wasn't just the weight of the confrontation. It was the years of fear and intimidation that had built up within these walls. Hastings took a seat behind his desk, feigning composure, but Ethan saw through it. The manager's fingers drummed anxiously against the polished wood, his posture stiff. Ethan remained standing, towering over the man who had spent so long lording his authority over others. He let the silence stretch, watching as Hastings shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Silence, Ethan had learned, was often more powerful than words. And in this moment, it was a weapon. Let's not waste time, Ethan finally said, his voice low and firm. I've seen enough to know that this branch isn't being run the way it should be. Hastings let out a short, forced chuckle. Sir, I assure you, Ethan cut him off. Stop. Just stop. Hastings' mouth snapped shut. You prey on employees who feel trapped, Ethan continued, taking a slow step forward. You isolate them, control them, make them believe they have no way out. But they do. Hastings shook his head, though his confidence was clearly faltering. With all due respect, Mr. Carter, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. I've always maintained a professional environment. If Lena or any other employee has an issue, they're welcome to bring it to me. Ethan let out a slow breath, reining in his frustration. They're too afraid to bring anything to you, Hastings. That's the problem. Hastings opened his mouth to argue, but Ethan was already pulling out his phone. With a tap, he played back the recording of the hushed conversation he had overheard earlier. Lena's voice, shaky yet resigned, filled the office. What choice do I have? He made it clear. If I don't do what he says, I'm gone. Miles' voice followed. Lena, you can't let him control you like this. He doesn't own you. Hastings paled. His fingers clenched into fists against the desk. That's taken out of context. Is it? Ethan countered, his voice dangerously calm. Because to me, it sounds like coercion, abuse of power, a hostile work environment. Should I go on? Hastings swallowed hard. Sir, You're done, Ethan interrupted, his voice unwavering. I've already contacted corporate HR. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. The color drained from Hastings' face. He shot up from his chair. You can't just fire me. Ethan's expression didn't waver. I can, and I have. Hastings' mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he looked truly powerless. It was a stark contrast to the man who had walked around this bank like he owned it, instilling fear in everyone beneath him. "I suggest you leave quietly," Ethan said. "Security will be escorting you out. If you try to retaliate in any way, I will personally ensure you never work in this industry again." Hastings hesitated, his chest rising and falling quickly. He knew there was no way out of this. Finally, he exhaled sharply and grabbed his briefcase. Without another word, he stormed past Ethan and yanked the door open. The entire bank had gone silent. Employees stood frozen at their stations. Customers looked on in confusion. Ethan followed at a measured pace. "Pack your things and go," he said simply. Hastings shot a glare at Lena as if blaming her for his downfall, but this time, she didn't shrink away. She met his gaze, her chin lifted, her shoulders squared. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. A new beginning. The tension in the bank remained thick as Hastings walked out, but the moment the door closed behind him, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the room. Employees exchanged glances, some whispering among themselves, while others simply stood in stunned silence. Ethan turned to the team. "You're safe now." Lena blinked, as if still processing that reality. "Is he really gone?" Ethan nodded. "For good." Miles let out a low breath, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe it." Kinney, the young teller, swallowed hard before speaking. "Sir, I don't mean to overstep, but this isn't just about Hastings." He hesitated, then pushed forward. "The way things have been run here, it's bigger than him. We've all been scared to speak up, because whenever we did, nothing changed. If we complained, we were written up. If we pushed back, we were replaced." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach churn. "I don't just want to fix this branch," Ethan said. "I want to fix the system, and I need your help to do that." Lena bit her lip. "And if we speak up, will anyone actually listen?" Ethan met her eyes. "I will." A long silence stretched between them before Lena finally nodded. A small but powerful shift. One by one, the other employees seemed to do the same. Ethan exhaled, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. But it was a weight he was willing to carry. "This is just the beginning," he said. "From now on, this branch operates differently. Transparency, accountability, and respect will define how we move forward." Lena straightened. "That's all we ever wanted." Ethan gave a small, reassuring smile. "Then let's make it happen. The message that matters." That night, as Ethan sat in his car outside the bank, watching employees lock up, he thought about the countless workplaces where fear and silence dictated the culture, where bad managers thrived while good employees suffered in silence. Hastings had been one of many, and Ethan knew his work wasn't done. Being a leader wasn't about power, it was about responsibility, and too often, those in power chose to look away. But not him, not anymore. If you ever feel trapped in a workplace where someone is abusing their power, speak up. And if you see someone else struggling, don't stay silent. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person to break the cycle. If this story resonated with you, share it. Someone out there might need to hear it. And if you believe in creating safer, better workplaces, subscribe to this channel. Because together, we can make a difference. 5. Making lasting changes. The immediate problem had been solved. Hastings was gone. But Ethan Carter knew that removing one toxic manager wouldn't be enough. The real work was just beginning. He had promised his employees change, and he intended to deliver. Ethan stood in the center of the bank, scanning the faces of the employees. Some were still in shock, processing the sudden shift in their workplace dynamic. Others looked relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. But there was also hesitation. Years of intimidation didn't vanish overnight. Lena stepped forward first. "What happens now?" Ethan met her gaze. "Now we rebuild." Assessing the damage. Ethan didn't waste time. The moment Hastings walked out, he pulled out his phone and sent a message to corporate HR, requesting an immediate review of the branch's policies, employee complaints, and performance records. He wanted a full report of everything Hastings had been involved in. As he put his phone away, Miles approached him hesitantly. "Sir, if I may." Hastings wasn't the only problem. The way this branch operates, it's broken. People have been too afraid to speak up for too long. Kenny nodded in agreement. It's not just about one manager. It's the culture he created. The idea that if you don't fall in line, you'll lose your job. Ethan appreciated their honesty. I need to understand exactly what's been going on here. I want to hear from all of you. At first, no one spoke. Then Lena sighed, stepping forward. We've had complaints before. About unfair schedules, forced overtime, pressure to meet unrealistic sales goals. But every time we reported it, nothing changed. Ethan's expression darkened. That changes today. Restoring trust. Ethan knew that simply saying things would change wasn't enough. Trust had to be earned. And it had to start now. From now on, this branch will be run differently, Ethan announced. But I can't do it alone. I need your help to make sure this place is one where people actually want to work. Lena still looked skeptical. And if things don't change? If corporate doesn't listen? Ethan gave her a firm look. They will listen. Because I'm not just fixing this branch. I'm fixing the system. And if they don't, I'll make them. For the first time that night, a spark of hope appeared in her eyes. To solidify his promise, Ethan took immediate action. He scheduled a meeting with the entire staff for the following morning, where they would openly discuss what needed to change. He arranged for HR representatives to visit the branch and conduct confidential interviews with employees, ensuring they felt safe to speak up. He also implemented an anonymous feedback system where employees could report concerns without fear of retaliation. I want transparency, Ethan said. If something isn't working, I want to know about it. Fixing the bigger picture. As the hours passed, employees slowly began to open up. They spoke about the pressure Hastings had placed on them, the favoritism, the unethical sales tactics. Ethan listened carefully, taking notes, already formulating a plan for corporate policy changes. He knew that Hastings wasn't the only one in the company operating this way. There were likely other managers using the same intimidation tactics, and it was his responsibility to find them before they caused more harm. The next step was implementing new training for all managers within the company. Ethan decided that every branch leader would undergo leadership training focused on ethical management, employee well-being, and maintaining a healthy work environment. He also proposed a restructuring of performance evaluations. No longer would sales numbers be the sole focus. Employee satisfaction and ethical practices would hold just as much weight. We can't just measure success in profits, Ethan told his team. We need to measure it in how we treat the people who make this company run. Empowering employees. One of Ethan's biggest goals was to ensure that employees never felt powerless again. He introduced an employee advocacy committee, a group of employees from different branches who would meet regularly with corporate leadership to discuss workplace concerns and suggest improvements. Lena, Miles, and Kenny were among the first to volunteer. You were brave enough to speak up when no one else would, Ethan told them. Now, I need you to help me make sure no one else ever has to feel that way again. They agreed, and for the first time in a long time, they felt like they had a say in their own workplace. A culture shift. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but the foundation had been set. Over the next few weeks, Ethan made regular visits to the branch, ensuring that every promise he made was being followed through. He personally checked in with employees, made adjustments to their schedules based on their needs, and held managers accountable for their behavior. And the results were undeniable. Employee morale improved. Productivity increased, not because of fear, but because people actually felt valued. Customers even noticed the difference, commenting on the more positive atmosphere inside the bank. Lena, once timid and reserved, became one of the strongest voices in the branch. She took pride in helping new hires feel welcome, ensuring they knew their rights, and that they never had to tolerate mistreatment. This place actually feels different now, she admitted to Ethan one afternoon. For the first time, I don't dread coming to work. That's how it should always be, Ethan replied. And not just here, everywhere. A message to all. As Ethan sat in his office a few months later, reviewing the latest employee satisfaction reports, he saw the difference in the numbers. Complaints were down. Retention rates were up. And most importantly, employees no longer felt afraid to voice their concerns. This was why he did what he did. But there were still other branches, other companies, other workplaces where employees felt trapped, unheard, and mistreated. Ethan knew his job wasn't done. Leadership wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. and he was determined to make that clear to every manager in the company. If you ever feel trapped in a toxic work environment, remember this: you are not alone. There are people who will listen, people who will stand with you. And if you see someone struggling, don't stay silent. Change starts with one voice. Be that voice. If this story resonated with you, share it. Someone out there might need to hear it. And if you believe in creating safer, better workplaces, subscribe to this channel. Because together, we can make a difference. Lessons learned. This story teaches us that leadership is about responsibility, not control. A true leader listens, observes, and takes action to create a healthy work environment. Toxic workplaces don't just harm employees. They affect the entire organization. When people in power abuse their positions, it takes courage and accountability to set things right. Meaningful message. Every workplace should be a place of respect, growth, and support. No one should have to fear their boss or feel trapped in a job because they have no choice. We must encourage a culture where employees feel safe to speak up and where ethical leadership is the standard, not the exception. Personal perspective. Ethan's actions remind us that change starts with one person deciding to stand up for what's right. Whether we're employees, managers, or executives, we all have a role in shaping our workplaces. Speaking up against injustice, supporting our colleagues, and demanding accountability are steps toward a fairer and healthier work environment. If this story inspired you, share it. Someone out there might need to hear it. And if you believe in creating safer, better workplaces, don't forget to follow and subscribe to Story Precious for more powerful stories that inspire change. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Together, we can make a difference.